My daughter, Julia, is a master at hide and seek. In fact, she's not here right now. I don't know where she is. She has hiding places in our house that I still haven't found. She won't reveal them to me. She just kind of pops out of places. There's a few that I found, and I was like, how did you fit in? In fact, sometimes, literally, she has been like I could see her, but I couldn't see her. She just has this gift, and sometimes it's works to her disadvantage. I mean, she is hidden in our van, and we've left her behind. That Stacy was taking the kids to Awana. It was even in winter, and she stayed out there the whole time. And she just knows how to blend into the group. And so I don't know if that's a gift or not, but it's something she's good at. I don't know if you've ever found yourself looking for God. If you've ever seemed like sometimes He's hard to find, like my daughter Julia. Well, from what we read in Luke 24, I want to share 3 reasons why that might be, why God might seem hard to find, and 3 ways that we can choose to respond to that. So, what does it look like when we're looking for God? Why is God sometimes hard to find? Well, sometimes it's because our expectations don't always line up to what God is doing. We see that in verse 1. Okay, the women were coming to the tomb with a certain expectation. The women were understanding. They were being dutiful, caring women. They were coming to lovingly prepare a body in a proper, respectful way, according to Jewish customs. We even saw before that they had come even before the Sabbath. They had prepared spices and perfumes, and they had to wait for the Sabbath to be over to follow the Jewish custom. But as soon as they could, they were being faithful. They were coming to prepare a body. And God was doing something different than they were expecting. They were just thought, it was a very sad moment. Many of you participated in a Good Friday service at different places, and you know that sense of like a funeral. There was death. Well, they came Sunday morning. They didn't come to a Resurrection Sunday service. They came to continue on mourning, to continue on that concept of just regret. Of this person whom they loved and who they had so many high hopes and expectations for. Now they were left to clean up the pieces. This is their expectations. But God was doing something very different than what they were expecting. Aren't you glad that God doesn't always do what we expect? But there are sometimes that makes Him hard to find because He's not lining up with our expectations. Last spring, I was talking to 3 different people about doing an internship here at Living Word. I had 5 people going through the ministry training intensive. I was recruiting for the Young Daniel Year on Mission. I do a lot with that. I was investing lots of time in that, finding quality young people and being excited about prospects. Within a month of time, the internship possibilities went away. The ministry training intensive closed down for the season. Almost all the Young Daniel prospects ended up doing something else. My high expectations did not line up with what I saw happening. In fact, I had no clue what God was doing. It was a very difficult season about a year ago as I was wrestling through that. Sometimes our expectations don't line up with what God is doing. Sometimes people ask Stacy and I how many kids we wanted when we were having a family. I guess some people think through these things. Our response is we wanted 2 or 4. I didn't know that God would give us 2 plus 4 with a bonus one on top of that. That's what we got up. So Stacy and I, we didn't talk about it that much, but as growing in a marriage, we had certain expectations about what parenting life would look like, how many children that would be, when we would start our parenting life, when we would end our parenting life. I remember when Virginia was first born, and she came along early, and I started doing the math. I'm like, oh, we're going to be young parents. And we're going to be out of the house early. We're going to have all this time. And we kept having kids, and I kept doing the math. And I'm like, well, now we're just like everyone else. And now we're young parents and old parents at the same time. And they're like, well, how does this line up? Our expectations did not line up with the reality that we saw. Does that mean we regret our life? Not in the least. No. We're so blessed with our children, we can't picture life without them. But what I'm saying is that God's idea did not line up with our expectations and what we were thinking. So when God is sometimes hard to find, sometimes it's because our expectations don't line up with what God is doing. Another reason can be in the next couple of verses, when you get there. When you get there. Can you get there? Because I can't. There it is. Okay. When we see what God is doing, we don't always recognize that God is doing that. You see it in the next verses 2 through 4. So now they came. Okay, the stone was rolled away. Well, great, because if you recognize they were coming with these spices prepared. They were going to prepare the body, but this stone had been rolled by a whole host of strong men, had been sealed, saying, "Do not remove this." And so they came faithfully to bring the spices. But do you ever think about what were they going to do when they got there? How were they going to get this stone rolled away? So they come and they're like, "Oh, well, good. I don't know how this is going to happen, but the stone's rolled away. Now we can get into the body." And they were probably assuming they were going to have to get someone to do that for them. That would have been their assumptions. They went in to find a body, but it wasn't there. So they assumed that someone had moved the body, right? They said, well, okay, now we have to go find where the body is. They were working out of these sort of assumptions. So God was at work, but the first assumption was based on the outward physical appearance of what was going on. Their assumption was that there was human work going on. Oh, someone moved the stone. Oh, someone moved the body. Someone in the physical realm had done this work. And the reality is that was not what's going on. In fact, I just heard this morning driving in something I hadn't thought about before. You know, the tomb, the stone didn't need to be rolled away. Well, why God did that for us, so that we would know the tomb was empty. You remember later on, Jesus, when he appeared to the disciples, he went through locked doors. He could go through walls. He could go through a stone. He didn't need to move it for his sake. But he did it for our sake. So there's something going on beyond the physical appearance. Go just a little bit farther in history, or actually kind of that same period in history. The Romans had expanded their domain around the entire known world. They had built this beautiful road system that allowed people to travel easily from great swaths of geography, from way north to way south, east, and west. The entire known world they had conquered and built this beautiful road system, the Roman road system, for easy travel, which made trade very much easier and easier to kind of control the subjects. They also, for trade, established this language, common trade language called Koine Greek, or Common Greek, is what the New Testament is written in. A language that almost everyone could comprehend and understand. Hardly anybody's first language, but almost everyone could understand. Similar to English today. Almost everyone could speak English, although it's often sometimes their second or third or fourth language. It is a common trade language. These two things, the Roman road and Koine Greek, God used to easily advance the good news of Jesus Christ to the entire known world at the time. You think about if that had been a different time in history, how much more difficult that would have been. Almost unthinkable to think how quickly the gospel spread to that geography. Now, the Romans didn't know they were building their kingdom for God's use. They were building it for their use. That was their understanding. But the reality is that God used it to expand his kingdom. And when we look back, we can see that it is exactly what was happening. We can see God is doing it, and this is often we can look back and see, but at the time we don't recognize that God is doing it. That's what the women were experiencing that morning. When 1 or 2 dozen people gathered together in a living room in the fall of 2011, I don't think anyone in that room had the expectation of starting a church. People gathered together to pray, to worship, to share scripture, to affirm a common faith, like the Apostles' Creed that we read this morning, and to mourn the loss of some great relationships. And as we continued to meet and pray together, the question began to be formed, should we start a church? Is God in this or not? And common objections came to mind. If they weren't spoken out loud, they were certainly thought in heads. We're too old. We're not in a good place emotionally. Does Whitewater need another church? These are questions that just, again, if they were not spoken verbally, they were thought in our heads. But God was thinking different thoughts than us. He was knitting us together. And we may not have known that. He was making us dependent on him. He was solidifying within us the truths that would be important to us as a community. God's work sometimes is moving even when we don't recognize it. We don't see it right away, but He's still doing it. And there's some things we can learn about God's work. God's work can be perplexing. In verse 4, it says the women were perplexed. It literally means they're at a loss with themselves. They're in doubt. They don't know how to decide or what to do. Have you ever been in a place like that in your life? Just perplexed. Just, what do I do, Lord? How do I... This stuff coming at me, this decision I have to make in my life, what do I do with it? A state of perplexment? Is that a word? I don't know. What is
Perplexity.
Perplexity. Ooh, okay. A state of perplexity. So, in other words, saying, Lord, what on earth are you doing here? Yeah, I thought you were working. I was so sure, but now I have no clue. This is what the women, they were perplexed. That's God's work can be like that. We have to recognize that. God's work can also be terrifying. Down in verse 5, the women were terrified. They were literally thrown into fear or frightened. In other words, there are times when we say, Lord, what is this? This is scary. This is new. This is something I've never experienced before. This is going outside of my expectations. This is going outside of my comfort zone. And what are we going to do when we interact with God's work in that way? But the other thing we can't miss, it comes at the very end of what we read, is God's work is also marvelous. When Peter at the end, he responded, and he said he went and investigated, and it says he marveled at what had happened. There was a wondering, but not a wondering like a perplexing, although there's some of that in there, but a wondering of like, man, there's something good going on here. I don't fully understand it. I don't fully grasp what's going on, but something good is happening. And we can recognize it about God's work. It can be perplexing, it can be terrifying, but it is also marvelous. The work of God is a good thing. And so even when we don't know that it's God working right away, we just always see our human, physical circumstances, we can recognize that God is working. But there's a third thing about why it's sometimes hard to find God. Sometimes it's because our expectations don't line up to what God is doing. Sometimes it's because we don't recognize that God is the one doing it. But sometimes it's because we're not seeking God in the right places. Verse 5, and the angel, they didn't know it was an angel at the time, but the angel, oh, hold on, they did. They were terrified. They bowed their faces. They knew it was an angel. And he said, why do you seek the living one among the dead? Why do you seek the living one among the dead? And where are we looking for Jesus? I don't know if you've ever looked for something, you can't find it, and then someone just comes in and points it out to you. It's like right there. Usually it's your wife who does that. It happened to me on Friday, just a couple days ago. We were at the breakfast table, and I wanted to read, because there's some things that happened in Jesus' life on Friday morning. I wanted to read that for the family, and I was looking for the Bible. And literally everyone on the table was saying, it's right there. They're pointing at the hutch right behind me. And we had a stack of books. And I was like, I'm looking at the stack of books. I don't see it. They're all 8 of them. It's right there. And I'm literally 4 inches away from it. And I don't see it. And they kept pointing. And finally, after my 3rd scan across the hutch, I saw it. It was literally sitting right on top of the pile of books that I was looking right at. And sometimes we just don't see things. We're not looking in the right places, or we're not looking in the right way. In John's account of the resurrection, which we didn't read, but we see that with Mary. So let me throw that up there for you. Mary came and she said she was looking for Jesus. When she had said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there and did not know that it was Jesus. She's actually talking to him. And Jesus said to her, woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you seeking? And supposing him to be the gardener, and she goes on to talk to him. But she did not, she's looking literally right at the guy, but she doesn't recognize, her eyes are not opened. And sometimes that is the case for us. It happened again on Sunday, Resurrection Sunday in the evening. And that's actually right where we stopped reading, Luke 24, verse 12. If you keep reading, verse 13, often called the road to Emmaus. There's 2 disciples, but I just want to pick out a couple verses in there. Starting in verse 15. While they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself approached and began traveling with them. But their eyes were prevented from recognizing him. So here they are, walking with Jesus, talking with Jesus. Jesus is explaining the scriptures to them, and they're not seeing it. They're missing it. Sometimes he's right in front of us and we don't know it. But sometimes we're just looking in the wrong places for Jesus. We're looking over here and he's over here. It could be in our traditions that we're looking. It could be in our relationships. It could be in our families. It could be in our hobbies. It's not that Jesus isn't in any of those places, that he can't be found there. It's just that sometimes our lives look more like a cemetery than a celebration. And we recognize that we're not finding Jesus in the tomb. And if that's the case, maybe we should look somewhere else. If he's not making an appearance in our lives, maybe we should do something different with our lives. Which takes us to our responses. How will we respond? I see 3 responses in the text today to choose from. The first one is the apostles. It's not chronological order, just the order I wanted to put them in. We can respond like the apostles. We can respond in disbelief. We see that in verse 11. These words appeared to them, the apostles, as nonsense, and they would not believe them. Nonsense, literally like idle talk, like just babbling. They're like, what are you saying? It doesn't make any sense to us. It'd be sort of like when Anya talks. She tells lots of things. I have no clue what it is. It's like that. And so they chose not to believe. They would not believe what the women were saying. It went outside of their realm of understanding. And they said, no, we can't do it. So one option is we can see God move in different ways than we're expecting. And we can say, no, that's not God. I'm expecting God to do this, and he did that. And so that's not God. We can see something, and we can say, no, I did that. That wasn't God. Mandy could just say, no, I have a really strong immune system, and my thumb just got better. Or we could acknowledge that God is in the midst of that. Or we could say, well, that would have happened anyway. Right? Or, I don't see God in this situation. And that happens all the time. It happens in our lives. Anytime we respond with doubt or discouragement or pride, we see the fruit of disbelief. So I don't want us to think about people out there. I want us to think about ourselves. When are we responding like the apostles? And the apostles are great people, right? I mean, these are the pillars of the church. But they still had moments of responding in disbelief, and we can have those moments. I think we want to avoid those moments, but that's an honest time. We can respond with disbelief. We can also be like Peter. We can respond with investigation. I love verse 12. There's so much. Just pay attention to the verb, the verse 12. Look at, it says he got up. Okay, Peter got up. He didn't stay where he was. It might have seemed like crazy talk. It was like nonsense, they said. But he was going to go and check it out just in case. He got up. He took some action. He went somewhere other than where he was. Sometimes we have to do that in our investigation. He also ran. He had some urgency to the matter. He didn't say, I'll look into that someday. Someday I'll get to that. He didn't mosey. He ran. He wanted to get there while the evidence and his own thoughts were fresh. Sometimes the Lord is speaking to us. The Lord is trying to get our attention in some way. And I just tell you, the best thing we can do is just respond as quick as possible. I mean, sometimes you can't because you're in the middle of something or you're working or whatever, but as much as is possible, just respond right away. The Lord is trying to get your attention at that time for a reason. So respond. Have some urgency to the matter. He also stooped when he got to the tomb. He had to get a little uncomfortable. You think about, he's stooped down, right? If you hold that position for a long time, it's not a comfortable thing. He was investigating the scene of a death. He had to get himself in a position where he could see. He was going to get the best viewpoint he could possibly get to. And so when he gets to the open, he's like, okay, what's going on there? No, maybe I can see better. Maybe I can see better down here. And whatever it takes to get to that position, he was willing to do that. He stooped. And then he looked in. He used observational skills. I can only imagine what was going on in his mind and his eyes and his heart. They're just running 1,000,000 miles a minute. He's just trying to take everything in and trying to figure out what was going on. This is a very active process in Peter's life. And then he got some evidence. He saw the linen wrappings were there. The body was not. Something was going on. This is more than just crazy talk. He's confirming what the women saw was going away. And then he went away. There comes a point when the investigation must end. It says he went away back to his home. We must head back home. We must head back to real life at some point. But what we discovered in our investigation can change our lives that we go back to. And lastly, we talked about this. He marveled. He was still processing. He was still trying to figure things out, and that's okay. But he knew enough to know that something amazing and something good had happened. That Peter investigated. Now, Peter, we can look at the life of Peter. He's a fascinating guy. He's did a lot of different things. But man, at this point in time, he responded differently than the apostles. He did not just accept the disbelief, but he decided to respond in investigation. Now, I hope you've seen this is not some passive investigation. If these things are true, they're going to lead to marvel and wonder. If these things are true, they're going to change our lives. That requires some investigation. And our third response option is to be like the women and remember in verses 6 and 8. Verse 6, the angel said, "Remember how he, Jesus, spoke to you. Remember." Now, the angel reminded them about Jesus, and I just hope we have encouragement here that they needed some outside help for them to remember. They needed someone, an angelic being no less, to come along and say, hey, remember what Jesus told you. And that's just fine. In fact, Jesus put us in a church, in a community, in a body of believers, so that we would have people to remind us, to remember. When we gather together on a Sunday morning, there's no accident that we worship all year round on a Sunday morning. Why? Because we remember the resurrection of Jesus. Even when we do communion, the Lord's Supper, we're remembering his sacrifice. Remember the things that Jesus spoke to you. And even, when these things were happening, we didn't have the gospel accounts, we didn't have the New Testament. These things were written down because they started to recognize, hey, we thought Jesus was coming back right away, but he's tarrying longer than we thought. We need to write these things down so that future generations can remember the teachings of Jesus. Remember how he spoke to you. And then in verse 8 it says they remembered his words. They remembered his words. And when we remember his words, what happens? It puts us in motion. Okay, so they remembered, and then they left the tomb. They went back, and they talked to the apostles. It spurred them on to share those words with the apostles. So they go into motion, they start sharing the words, and remembering his words puts an extra spring in our step, extra joy on our face. We can even get to the point that we don't care if people think we're talking nonsense. That's where the women were at. They were going to share anyway, because they remembered his words. It all came out of that. So we have to remember that God's work doesn't always match our expectation. God's work doesn't always look like God's work from our viewpoint. If we're having a hard time finding Jesus, maybe we should look somewhere else or look in a different way. But lastly and most importantly, how will we respond? How will we respond? Well, can I encourage us not to respond in disbelief? If you're still trying to figure out this Jesus thing, that's okay. But don't stop investigating. Continue, be like Peter. Just continue to investigate. Be active in that investigation. And if you've been walking with Jesus for a while, don't forget. Remember. Remember the time he has spent with you. Remember the teaching he has given you. And keep on investigating for more of him. Don't settle for memories. Don't settle for all the things that God has done in the past. Let those memories spur us on to more of what God has for us. So we remember what Christ has done. It spurs us into the future.